Aaliyah Garrison pulled her hoodie over her head, curling up on the hard plastic chair near the gate at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Her backpack lay between her legs, her hands absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone. She was tired, but also excited. She could be home in a few hours. Her mother had booked this direct flight weeks ago, double-checking everything as she always did. Aaliyah had traveled alone before, and this was no different. Or so she thought. A hoarse voice came over the intercom, announcing a flight delay. The crowd around her groaned in disappointment. Aaliyah sighed, adjusting her headphones. But then, a strange feeling crept into her mind. An older woman, a few seats away, was staring at her. Not a quick glance and then away, but a steady, searching stare. A feeling of unease welled up inside her, but she pushed it aside. A few minutes later, a uniformed airport employee approached her. His posture was stiff, his face expressionless. Aaliyah removed one earbud as he stopped in front of her. "Excuse me, ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" She blinked. "Oh, yes, of course." She quickly dug into her hoodie pocket, pulled out her boarding pass, and handed it to him. He took it, stared at it, flipping it over as if something was wrong. "Are you traveling alone?" Aaliyah nodded. "Yes, I usually do." The man pursed his lips, handed the boarding pass back but remained still. "I need to see your ID, too." A chill ran down her spine. She looked around. No one else had been asked that question. Families, couples, businessmen, all going about their own business. Only she was stopped. "Is there a problem?" Her voice was steady, but her heart began to pound. The man didn't answer right away. She could feel the tension in his eyes. She slowly took out her wallet, but before she could show her ID, 2 more security guards appeared. She didn't know where they came from, but suddenly, she felt surrounded. "Could you come with us for a moment?" One of them said, his tone not a request but a command. Aaliyah stood up, feeling suffocated. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just waiting for my flight home." The surrounding eyes began to turn to her. Whispers. Uncertainty. She felt smaller than ever. "Please cooperate, ma'am. We need to verify some information." Aaliyah opened her mouth to protest, but just then, a familiar voice rang out. "Aaliyah." She turned. Her father. He strode toward them, his face stern, his eyes sharp. He wore a neat suit, the badge on his chest that she had known since childhood. The security guard saw him, and his expression changed. "This is my daughter." His voice was hard. "And I want to know why you're treating her like a criminal." The room fell silent. The airport staff looked at each other in confusion. One of them flipped through the information, then paled. They had made a big mistake. Aaliyah took a shaky breath, but this time, she didn't feel small. Aaliyah stepped up to the counter, her hand unconsciously tightening around the wallet in her pocket. She pulled it out, the security guard's scrutinizing gaze making her heart beat faster. "Routine security check," the man in front of her said, his tone emotionless. "Just verifying information," he added when she frowned. Aaliyah silently held out her student ID, the only thing she had on her. The man glanced at it briefly before asking. "Where are your parents?" She frowned, a feeling of unease growing in her chest. "I'm 16. I don't need them with me." The atmosphere suddenly felt different, heavier. She could sense the change in the security guard's demeanor. Aaliyah wasn't stupid. She knew what was going on. But she also knew better than to make a scene right now. The man nodded. "Stay here for a while." He turned away, leaving her alone. Aaliyah clutched her phone tightly in her hand. The woman who had been staring at her was now whispering something to another agent. Her stomach clenched. This wasn't normal. A few minutes passed, and then two more airport agents approached. A tall, thin man in a TSA uniform, and a short woman with a badge pinned to her jacket. "Miss Garrison?" the woman asked, her tone sharp. Aaliyah nodded, anxiety rising in her chest. "Can you come with us for a moment?" Her heart pounding, she glanced down at her phone, considering calling her dad. But she stopped. This had to be a mistake, right? "Why?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "Your ticket has been flagged for additional security." The TSA agent's voice sounded gentle, but his expression was not. Aaliyah tightened her grip on her backpack. "Flag? Why?" The woman smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. "Just a random check. Nothing to worry about." Aaliyah glanced around. No one else had been pulled aside. She felt her heart rate increase. The whispers, the furtive glances, the fact that no one else had been randomly selected, she began to realize that this was more than just a security issue. This was about her. But what happened next would prove beyond doubt. She followed them down into the terminal, her steps quick and light, but her heart rate quickening. The TSA officer led her to a small screening area, one of the side rooms reserved for additional screening. The door closed behind her. Aaliyah knew, this wasn't a mistake. The room was almost empty. Except for a desk, a few neatly arranged chairs, and 3 people in the coldly lit room. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale white glow, reflecting off the lifeless tile floor. The gray walls were bare, without a single painting or sign. The room felt drained of all human life, leaving only a tense silence. A stocky man leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. His gaze was calm, but it made the air in the room feel thick. Just inside the doorway, a woman in a coat raised her hand, signaling Aaliyah to stop. "Put your bag down," she said. Aaliyah hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, her breathing shallow. But then she put it down, doing as she was told. Her hand released slowly, as if she still had some measure of control. "I don't understand," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I've already been through security." The man pushed himself firmly away from the table, standing up straight. His eyes scanned her slowly, up and down. "We need to ask a few questions, that's all." The silence that followed stretched unnaturally long. "Where are you flying to?" he asked. "Indianapolis." "Who bought your ticket?" "My mother." The woman tilted her head. "And you're traveling alone?" Aaliyah frowned. "Yes. Like I said." The TSA officer glanced at the man standing next to her. "Do you have a return ticket?" "No. I live there." The air in the room seemed to tighten. The woman scribbled something on a clipboard. Her pen moved quickly, the sound of friction against paper loud in the uncomfortably quiet room. "Do you have family in Phoenix?" Aaliyah crossed her arms, sighing. "My uncle. But I'm here for basketball camp." She tilted her head, her gaze growing sharper. "Why does this matter?" The woman didn't answer her question. "How long have you been in Phoenix?" Heat rose in Aaliyah's chest. This wasn't normal. She'd flown alone many times before. Same airline. Same routine. But never pulled aside like this. Her fingers curled around the strap of her bag. Her breathing quickened. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. The man stepped forward, his presence cutting through her thoughts. The empty space around them seemed to shrink, pushing her into an invisible corner. "Excuse me." Aaliyah clenched her jaw, then exhaled slowly. "I don't understand why I'm being asked this." The woman finally met her eyes. In the cold light, they seemed to reflect nothing. "Your ticket was flagged. That happens sometimes." Aaliyah smiled faintly. "Who? Who flagged my ticket?" "Because I didn't see anyone else being stopped." Silence. The man took another firm step forward. Aaliyah's stomach clenched. "Miss, are you refusing to cooperate?" The air in the room became more suffocating than ever. "No, I just..." "Then we ask that you answer the questions without any attitude." He interrupted, his voice sharp. Her face burned. Anger flared inside her, but she swallowed it down well. She knew, one small mistake, and the emptiness of this room could swallow her up completely. Aaliyah's fingers trembled as she clenched the edge of her jacket. The woman across from her tapped her clipboard, her sharp eyes never leaving Aaliyah. "Have you ever been questioned by airport security?" The question rang out, cold and emotionless. "Before?" Aaliyah's voice trembled slightly, and she cleared her throat, trying to control her breathing. The woman didn't answer, just picked up the pen, waiting. Aaliyah swallowed, feeling something catch in her throat. "No." "Have you ever had trouble with law enforcement?" "What?" She flinched, her heart beating faster. "No." The woman nodded, making another note. Each scribble on the paper felt like a cold knife cutting into Aaliyah's nerves. "Do you have cash?" Aaliyah frowned, staring at her. "Why?" The woman paused, inhaling through her nose, patiently waiting for an answer. "No. I have a debit card." Again, the pen slid across the paper. Aaliyah began to feel the air in the room thicken, each breath growing heavier. "Okay, step over here." Aaliyah's breath hitched. She waited, but nothing came. Only the scrutinizing gaze of the security officer. "Why do we need to search your bag?" Aaliyah tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. "You already scanned it." The TSA officer stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you refusing to search your bag?" She stared at them, her heart pounding in her chest. If she said no, they would push harder. If she said yes, they would still search. She took a reflexive step back. The large man beside her reached for his radio. "We could use some extra help here." Aaliyah's chest tightened. She hadn't done anything. "I haven't done anything." Her voice rose, almost cracking. The woman raised her hands, her smile papery. "If there's nothing to hide, then there's nothing to worry about." Aaliyah's vision blurred with anger and helplessness. She unzipped the bag, pushing it toward them. The large man rummaged through her things as if searching for something specific. Clothes. Diaries. Chargers. A half-empty bag of Skittles. Finally, as if expecting something else, he patted the bottom of the bag, turned it over, and shook it. A pen rolled across the desk. He glanced at his coworkers, exchanging knowing glances. "It's okay," the woman finally said. "You can have your things back." Aaliyah shakily picked up each item, stuffing them back into her bag. She just wanted to leave. But then, the voice spoke again. "One last thing. Go to the other room again." Aaliyah's stomach clenched. "Why?" The woman smiled, a smile colder than the air in the room. "We need to take a picture of you for documentation." Aaliyah's fingers dug into the fabric of her hoodie, her nails digging in, as if clinging to something solid in a world that was slipping out of control. "No," she said, her voice muffled. The fat man's expression darkened. "You, no," she shouted, a scream somewhere between emotion and something close to desperation. "Back off. This is too much." Security was coming. Counting terminal for secondary screening, the fat man said into his radio. Aaliyah's hands were shaking. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing. But they were treating her like a criminal. Her throat tightened as the security team entered. She knew for sure that the commotion was just beginning. Her heart pounded in her ears as she watched the tall security guard enter. Broad shoulders, a hard face, as if it had seen decades of airport conflict. "What's the problem?" he asked, his eyes darting back and forth between the agent and Aaliyah. She's refusing to follow standard security procedures. Aaliyah's jaw clenched. That's not right. The woman crossed her arms. We just asked for a simple photo for documentation and she's making it difficult. Aaliyah felt her hand tighten around the strap of her backpack. Because I shouldn't have to do this. I didn't do anything wrong. The agent let out a breath, placing his hands on his hips. If they're asking for a photo, just take it and you can move on. Aaliyah shook her head. No. I have to go to the gate, wait for my flight like everyone else. The tension in the room seemed to be boiling. The TSA agent's voice dropped. Either you comply, or we will take further action. Aaliyah's breathing grew longer and faster. Arrest me for sitting at the gate? The woman gripped her pen impatiently. You're causing a disturbance, Ms. Garrison. Aaliyah let out a low laugh. She knew what she was facing. And it would not end well. I'm making a scene. You dragged me here. I didn't do anything, the agent insisted, stepping toward her. You need to calm down. Aaliyah felt her hands begin to shake again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was a surge of anger, frustration, helplessness. She glanced toward the open door, wondering if anyone outside could hear. Passengers walked by, unconcerned, oblivious. If she screamed, would anyone help her? Or would they just see what these people wanted them to see, a troubled, uncooperative teenager? The security guard sighed, rubbing his temples, as if this were a minor problem. Look at the kid. If you don't cooperate, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the airport. Aaliyah's stomach clenched. You are a potential security risk, the agent continued, her tone cold, impersonal, as if she were just a file to be processed. Her breathing, a security threat. Her very existence, a problem to be eliminated. I'm just a 16-year-old girl trying to get home. Her voice shook, but not with fear anymore. With resentment. The woman in the coat just shrugged, her eyes impassive. It's not our problem anymore. The security guard stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. Come on, we'll escort you out. Aaliyah's legs felt locked in place. Was this really happening? It was like a slow-motion nightmare, something she couldn't control. She forced herself to take a deep breath. I want to call my dad. The man scoffed firmly. That's not necessary. Hell no need. Aaliyah snapped back, anger flaring in her voice. She pulled the phone from her pocket before anyone could stop her. The woman held out her hand. Put it away. Aaliyah stepped back, her thumb pressing the call button. The ringing rang, echoing in her ears, matching the pounding of her heart in her chest. 1 ring. 2 rings. Then. Aaliyah. Her father's voice, calm, steady, was at odds with how she felt. She let out a shaky breath. Dad. I need you right now. The room fell silent. What's going on? Her father's voice suddenly became sharp. Aaliyah turned away from the agents, her grip on the phone tightening. They're kicking me out of the airport. There was silence on the other end of the line, then a firm voice. Where's your security room? She took a breath. Near Terminal 4. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor came through the phone. Her father was coming. Missed the call. Aaliyah turned, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Her heart was pounding, her breathing rapid. She knew they couldn't throw her out without a good reason, but that didn't stop the fear from creeping in. I'm on my way. Her father's voice rang out firmly over the phone. Firm enough, strong enough that for the first time since it all began, she felt a glimmer of hope. The security officer sighed, his eyes flickering with hesitation. If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll have to call the airport police. Aaliyah's breath hitched. Her father must have heard, because his voice was sharp, unwavering. Don't move. Don't say another word. I'll be there in 5 minutes. And just like that, everything changed. The security officer hesitated. A flicker of confusion crossed their eyes, as if the wall of authority they had erected was cracking. The TSA agents exchanged uneasy glances. They had assumed she was alone. They had assumed no one would come for her. But they had been wrong. And when her father arrived, they would regret everything. The next 5 minutes stretched like an eternity. Aaliyah stood with her arms crossed, her body rigid, the phone still clutched in her cold palm. No one spoke. But the tension in the room grew thicker, like an invisible smoke seeping through the cracks. They were waiting. Just like her. Aaliyah swallowed. She had never felt more relieved to hear her father's voice, but she also knew what was coming. Terence Garrison was no ordinary father. He was a lawyer, a respected civil rights lawyer. And if these people thought they could intimidate her, they had no idea who they were up against. Outside the room, the dull sounds of the station continued. Footsteps, the rolling of luggage carts, announcements echoing over the intercom. It all seemed surreal, as if she were trapped in some alternate reality where the slightest mistake could get her thrown out. Then, footsteps. Not hurried. Not hasty. But steady, purposeful. All eyes in the room turned toward the door. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a navy blue suit entered. His gaze swept the room, cold and sharp as a razor. Confidence radiated from every step, from the way he loosened his cuffs, from the way he stopped in the middle of the room without saying a word. His mere presence was enough to make the air tense. A security guard gulped. A TSA agent straightened unconsciously. But Aaliyah didn't need to look any further. Her father was here. Terence Garrison's salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, giving him a neat yet authoritative look. His expression was unreadable, his face a stone wall, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room in a split second, taking in every detail. Terence Garrison had arrived. The room seemed to freeze. The security guards straightened immediately. The woman in the coat clutched her clipboard under her arm. Aaliyah exhaled, knowing her father was there, but her heart was still pounding. Her father barely glanced at her, just a moment's glance before turning to face the security guard. "Who's in charge here?" His voice was low and cold. A police officer stepped forward, hesitant. "Sir, this is a restricted area." "No more," Terence said, his tone as sharp as a knife. He pulled out his phone, holding the screen up for all to see. "I just spoke to the airport board. They know I'm here." The tension in the room grew. Someone swallowed. Someone started explaining why my daughter was detained and threatened with removal. His voice dropped, but the pressure grew. The woman in the coat cleared her throat. "Sir, we..." "Name?" Terence interrupted, not hiding his impatience. She hesitated. "Patricia Dawson. I work for the airport board." He nodded, then turned his sharp gaze to an officer. "And you're the man who took her?" The officer stiffened, trying to maintain his professional demeanor. "James Wilcox." Terence stepped forward, each step squeezing the air in the room. "James." "Patricia." He spelled out the name like an indictment. "My daughter was sitting at the gate, doing nothing wrong, and you dragged her in here. You searched her pockets, questioned her for no reason. And then threatened to kick her out of the airport." He paused, his eyes never leaving them. "So, one more time, I'll ask. Why?" Silence. Aaliyah crossed her arms, looking at them, waiting. She wanted to hear them say it. That they found her suspicious. Because of the way she looked. Because someone had decided she didn't belong here. Patricia coughed, trying to regain her composure. Her ticket was flagged for further inspection. Terence's eyebrow rose slightly. "And, how many other passengers on that flight were flagged?" Silence. He chuckled, but there was no mirth in his eyes. As I thought. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Sir, this is standard protocol. No, it isn't. Terrence's voice was low, but each word carried a heavy weight. It's not protocol to single out one person. It's not protocol to harass a young girl, treating her like a criminal just because of her appearance. And it's certainly not protocol to think you can do it without consequences. The air was heavy. Aaliyah looked at them, then at her father. She had never seen anyone so quiet. Terrence Garrison hadn't come to ask questions. He had come to demand justice. Wilcox walked in. We had gone through all the security procedures, but no, Terrence was still broken, not literally, but internally, with the anger burning in the back of his chest. You abused them. The room fell silent. No one took a breath too loudly, no one dared to move. The air was as tense as a string about to snap. Slowly, he pulled out his wallet, took out a card, and placed it on the table, right between them. His gesture was slow but sure, as if he were laying down an irrefutable statement. My office will file a formal complaint with TSA and airport management. If necessary, we will pursue legal action for racial discrimination and wrongful detention. Aaliyah's heart ached. She could hear the suppressed anger in her father's voice. No need to shout, no need to threaten, his presence alone was enough to make everyone bow their heads. Patricia swallowed. Sir. I saved it. Terrence said, pocketing his phone. You're just sorry I showed up. He turned to Aaliyah. His expression softened, his eyes shining with genuine concern. Are you okay? She nodded, though the lump in her throat made it difficult to form words. Terrence placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, a small gesture that provided the steadiness she needed. He looked back at the group, his tone losing all patience. You will personally escort her back to the gate. And you will apologize. Patricia and Wilcox exchanged worried glances. The security officer sighed, bowing his head, as if knowing there was no going back. Aaliyah took a shaky breath, but this time it wasn't out of fear. They were the ones worrying now, the ones desperately trying to make amends. The walk back to the gate was eerily quiet. Each step felt heavier, not just from exhaustion but from the weight of humiliation. Patricia and Wilcox followed silently, their postures heavy. The people who had dragged her from her seat now looked as if they wanted to disappear. Terrence walked beside her, solid as a brick wall. He didn't need to say anything else, didn't need to make any more threats. His silence was enough to unnerve them. When they reached the gate, Aaliyah's seat was still empty, her bag still there, as if nothing had happened. But inside her, everything had changed. She was no longer the passive one. She was no longer the one who had to ask for permission to be respected. Terrence folded his arms. His gaze was as sharp as a knife, and Patricia cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. Miss Garrison, we apologize for the inconvenience. Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. That was it? Was that all they could say? Wilcox exhaled. None of them dared meet her eyes. But what happened next would make them regret this more than anything. Terrence let out a sharp laugh. Misunderstanding, he repeated, his voice full of mockery. I think you know exactly what you're doing. Patricia's hands jerked at her sides, as if she were trying to find some footing in the storm ahead. Do you have children, sir? Terrence interrupted. He tilted his head a little, studying her as if weighing whether the question was worth answering. Finally, he said, his voice soft but sharp as a knife. Do you have children? Patricia hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Then imagine these are your children. He stepped forward, forcing her to face him. Imagine your children being treated like criminals. For no reason. Imagine them being frightened and humiliated in public. He paused, letting the words sink in. We're sorry for the misunderstanding, is that enough for you? Patricia looked away. Aaliyah stood beside her, her chest tightening as the truth of what had happened finally seemed to sink into the woman's awareness. Maybe they'd done this before. Maybe they'd pulled someone who looked like her aside. Assumed the worst. Assumed it was protocol. But this time, they wouldn't be able to quietly ignore the consequences. The whispers around them grew louder. Other passengers were starting to take notice. Some had probably seen Aaliyah being dragged away. They'd seen her return, still flanked by security. And her father, he stood firm in the midst of it all, unflinching. Terence glanced around the terminal, then back at the clerk. "Do you know who I am?" Patricia's expression was tense. "Yes, sir." "Good." He nodded. "Then you know this isn't over." Wilcox shifted on his feet. "Sir, if you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything." Terence's voice was smoothly controlled, but the weight of his words left no room for error. "I'm making it clear that there will be a formal complaint. There will be an investigation. And when the public hears about this, you'll be held accountable for every decision you make today." Patricia's face paled. Aaliyah could see it now, the slow realization, the fear starting to creep into her eyes. Headlines. Backlash. Potential job losses. And for the first time, they looked worried. But Terence wasn't done. He turned to the security guard. "I want the names of everyone involved. I want an accurate written report." There was no room for compromise. There was no forgiveness in his eyes. Anger, pain, and justice, all wrapped up in his words. This time, they would be held accountable. The man nodded stiffly. "I'll send it to you right away." Aaliyah clutched her backpack, her fingers still trembling slightly. She felt so small in that secure room, so helpless, yet she stood there, watching them try to fix what they had done. But something was different. The air in the room was strangely stifling, and in that moment, she realized, Patricia had seen. The woman's shoulders were straight, her lips pressed together until they were white. A long silence stretched between them. "Miss Garrison, we really—" "Don't," Aaliyah interrupted. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was cold enough to make the air in the room sink. She didn't want to hear empty apologies. Not now. Not ever. Terence checked his watch. "Her flight leaves in 10 minutes. His voice was sharp. "You've wasted enough of her time." With that, he turned, leading Aaliyah out of the room. The staff stood there, motionless, as if unsure whether to stay or leave. The power had shifted, and they knew it. Aaliyah stepped outside, taking a deep breath, but the air did nothing to ease the unease spreading in her chest. As she sat down in the waiting chair, Terence dropped down beside her, sighing. "Are you okay?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah. I think so." But she wasn't sure if she meant it. The weight of what had happened still weighed heavily on her shoulders. The anger, the injustice, it was all there, simmering, not going away with a nod. But at least now, she didn't have to carry it alone. It wasn't her problem anymore. Soon, the whole world would know. Aaliyah clutched her phone as her father typed something on his computer. She knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't going to stay buried in a tiny security room or within the confines of this airport. As soon as he hit send, his message appeared on the law firm's website, circulating on social media. A detailed account of what had happened. No embellishments, no cover-ups. The bare truth. Aaliyah refreshed the screen. Her heart skipped a beat as the comments began to flood in. Unbelievable. This happened too often. Sue them, they deserved it. She swallowed. This was just the beginning. She knew, once the plane took off, the world beneath her feet would never be the same again. Her chest tightened, an unfamiliar feeling creeping into her mind. Uncertainty. Anger. Or simply an unnamed pain. Aaliyah wasn't sure, only that as she looked around at the unfamiliar eyes, she felt as if everything she had just experienced was still lingering, not letting go. She glanced at her father. He was silent, but the way he tightened his grip on the strap of his bag, the way he held his back straight as if ready to protect her from the world, said it all. Her father didn't need to say it out loud for her to know he was angry, disappointed, but most of all, here for her. "Do you think this will really change anything?" Aaliyah asked softly, her voice lost in the surrounding noise. Terence let out a long, heavy breath. "It has." He folded his arms, his gaze drifting forward, where a woman had returned to her seat, nodding briefly to Aaliyah. A quiet nod of support. She wasn't alone. A man walked by, his eyes flicking past Terence and then back to Aaliyah. His gaze was unreadable, but no longer indifferent. She wasn't sure if they'd seen the post, or had just overheard the confrontation, but suddenly, she felt less invisible. The loudspeaker blared, "Flight 287 to Indianapolis is boarding now." Terence stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "Come on, kid. Time to go home." Aaliyah tightened her hold on her bag, standing, but as she headed toward the boarding line, she noticed Patricia Wilcox and the security officer still standing behind her. They were whispering, their expressions tense, their postures rigid. They knew what was coming. They had assumed she would just walk away. They were wrong. Sitting in the window seat, Aaliyah leaned her forehead against the cool glass, exhaling deeply. She replayed it all in her mind, the first moment the officers asked for her ID, the way they searched her bag, as if expecting to find something illegal. How they thought they could push her away, only to believe no one would care. But someone did. Her father had told her stories from the past, of the cases he had solved, of the families he had fought for. She had always listened, always understood it in the abstract. But now, she had lived it. Aaliyah pulled out her phone, her fingers sliding across the screen. She typed, "I was humiliated today. But I am not alone." She hesitated, then hit post. By the time she landed, her story had been shared more than 10,000 times. People were watching. People were listening. And this time, there would be consequences. Because silence was no longer an option. Stories like Aaliyah's happen more often than we realize. They creep into our daily lives, playing out in the shadows of indifference, buried under excuses and silence. But that doesn't mean they're unimportant. On the contrary, they remind us of the injustice that still exists. Aaliyah is not the first person to experience this, and she certainly won't be the last. But there's one thing that sets her story apart: she chose to speak up. She refused to let fear cloud her truth. She refused to be dismissed. And in that moment, change began. Injustice cannot exist when we confront it. Every time we speak up, we not only protect ourselves, we pave the way for others. When we refuse to be silent, we not only demand justice for one individual, but we create a broader wave of change. So if you have ever felt wronged, if you have ever felt alone in this world, know that you are not alone. Don't let fear hold you back. Speak up, act, hold those who have done wrong to you accountable. Your voice has more power than you think. And if this story touches you, don't let it pass you by. Share, get involved, listen more. Because stories like this need to be told. Because every word can be a spark that lights a fire for justice.